first executive director, which is a very proud fact for me because it's really nice to know that a woman was in that position to start. I just thank you for doing that because I'm sure it wasn't easy. And thanks to Tamara, who spoke last week, and thank you to Bob Parker, who will be speaking next week, and Travis, who will speak on looking to the future in the final week in March. Also, thank you to the staff for helping prepare this and ideating it before I was a staff member here. Thank you especially to Liza for setting up so thoughtfully all the snacks tonight. Thank you. And I would really like to introduce Betty Potter. After her talk, we're going to have a question and answer session. So keep your questions in the back of your mind. Don't forget them. And then afterward, of course, you can help yourself to some more snacks. You're also, I feel like people, I know it's a weird time, but you need to take a lot of snacks. So if you need a little recharge in the middle, that's okay too. You can even put up your hand and I'll deliver you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Betty Potter, who was born and raised in Sheboygan. She graduated from North High School and went on to receive an associate's from the University of Wisconsin-Sheboygan, a bachelor's of science degree from Silver Lake College, which she would later teach at, a master's of science degree from Cardinal Stritch University, and a doctorate in management from Walden University. And she became the director of the Sheboygan County Museum in 1977. She served in that capacity for 14 years. And during her time, there were a lot of new things that happened. The major volunteer program was something that she spearheaded. Rotating exhibits started, and the annual museum days were initiated during her time. She also had ongoing demonstrations and lectures, and hence our title, she built this campus from having just the Taylor House and added on the Weinhold Log Cabin, the Bob and Stat Cheese Factory, and the barn that we now have on the far end of our property. So, after leaving the museum, she completed her graduate work and taught public administration at Silver Lake College, her alma mater. In her remarks tonight, she will share the growth of the museum and related activities during her 14 years. So please join me in welcoming our friend and esteemed guest, Betty Potter.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here tonight to be helping the Society celebrate its 100th anniversary. And I just want to explain that in my presentation, some of the pictures aren't that clear because years ago we pasted our pictures in great big scrapbooks upon the advice of the State Historical Society. But today we had a hard time getting a good scan of them. But for the most part, they're pretty good, and you'll be able to tell what it is that I'm talking about. So we're talking about the period from 1977 to 1991, and we then established the museum's identity through objects, culture, and people. We're talking about buildings and buildings because we were building a museum complex through objects, buildings, education, and our organization. Let's look at the reasons for the museum's existence. We're here to have and hold collections and to do things with those collections. And in 1977, all of the objects were in the Taylor House. About 90% were displayed, and the other 10% were in storage in the attic and in the basement. This is what the Taylor House looked like when I started. A well-known interior or decorator had recommended that the color be that dark green, almost black, the trim. I think he chose that because it covered well, and it went in with the color of the brick. I don't know if they knew what the original color was, but I'm glad we're back to that cream color. So I'm going to show you an example of what was all displayed in the Taylor House then. I'm pictured here with the two guides I started with, Virginia Klunk on the left and Catherine Beckman on the right. And we're standing in the music room with our musical instruments. We displayed our toys. These are dolls in one of our glass display cases. We displayed our guns, and that was a fantastic picture in the paper. People really laughed about it. We displayed our paintings. This is a picture of the burial of Hiawatha, based on Longfellow's poem, Hiawatha. We displayed our women's fashion. We displayed our dollhouse with all of the furnishings. And these are children going through on tours now. On the left, they're in our farm implement room, and on the right, they're looking at Indian artifacts in the Indian room. So we had to market the museum, and we did that by identifying a targeted audience who would benefit from the object's meanings. So when we think of Sheboygan County, we think of furniture manufacturing, chairs in particular. But of course, we had toy manufacturers like the Gartons. So we did we did a temporary exhibit of items from their personal collection. And this is a picture of Bob and Dave Garton with their toys. Of course, the Lindemann Circus started in Sheboygan, eventually becoming Seals Sterling. And they performed behind the post office where this sign is. So we also did temporary exhibits of circus collectibles. This is Jim Siegel, who had his own extensive collection. He's holding somebody else's artifact here. And then, of course, baseball is an all-time American sport locally, too, so we did display items from the Old Timers Baseball Association. Our log house is considered an object. I'll explain that more later, but that, of course, portrays our pioneer heritage. The barn, of course, is another object, and it portrays our farming heritage. That was our maintenance man at the time, Edgar Auschenbach, who's walking in the field there. And then our cheese factory, of course, is another object, and it portrays our cheese industry. We had to use these objects to make the museum a lively place. We encouraged the participation of more and more people and made the museum a lively place of social discourse. So we did that by an annual museum days, and this particular day we were celebrating the county's 150th anniversary. That's a later guide, that's Maurice Siebert that I pictured with. And we celebrated that occasion with helium balloons. So what we did was we sent the balloons up that day with notes inside telling the finders that whoever sent the note back from the furthest place would get a prize. And in this case, a little girl named Elaine from Toronto said her sister found the balloon, that a big storm blew it across Lake Huron. And so, of course, they got the prize. We brought in old farm implements one time, and of course that drew a lot of interest. And this was the crowd that turned out for the dedication of the log house in July 1979. And this was another crowd that turned out for German Heritage Days. I'm going to show you a better picture after a while. But that's a German band in front, and there were just swarms of people behind that band. So our goals were achieved then by collecting small and large objects like buildings. And the building collecting started in 1977. We had to decide whether we wanted to restore the Taylor House to reflect the lifestyle of that period, 1850 to the 1890s, or whether we wanted to create a unique farmstead. So we had to assess our restoration and display costs, the Taylor House restoration versus costs to move the buildings. Of course, we had limited display space in the house, we had artifacts stored in the house, and we had limited storage space. So we figured we'd have more display space in the added buildings, and it would cost less to move those than to restore the house. And I think that's still the case today. I think Travis told me it would cost $5 million to restore the Taylor House. So the collected buildings were in the wrong place, and by that I mean they couldn't serve as museums in their original locations. So we put them together as portable objects, but to be part of the museum, they had to house certain collections. So the first building we moved up was the Wine Hole Log House. And we had a lot of volunteer help for that. Our sheriff, Vern Beckman, was the coordinator of the project. The sheriff's deputies helped, and so did the local CBs. This is what it looked like on its original location. There's a crane lifting the top off, but notice that all of the logs on the right are labeled or numbered so that it could be reassembled up on the museum on Taylor Hill. And that's Vern Beckman, the sheriff, stabilizing the log house for the move. This is the top in transit. And now here we are back up on the hill with the crane putting the top back on. And this is how it looked when it was reassembled on Taylor Hill. And here's another view. And this is how it looked when it was finished. These projects always attract a lot of people. So that's Janetta Pilling on the left. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they gave us a 34-star flag to fly on the house. And that's Roland Schomburg on the right. I'll talk more about him later. This is the dedication brochure from July 1979. And here we have a picture of the Webbers cutting the blue ribbon. Dolores and Vernon Weber donated the house, and that's our president, Carl Rigatti, on the left. The State Historical Society gave us an award, or the Sheriff's Deputies Award for that project. So that's the director of the State Historical Society on the left, Richard Ernie. Next to him is Bob Methfessel, the president of the Sheriff's Deputies. Standing behind me is Vern Beckman. Next to the right of Vern is Carl Rigatti, our president then, and standing in front of him is Emma Plappert, our treasurer. The next building we moved up was the barn. This is what the property looked like across the street from the museum before it was developed, with all the stores over there right now. And the Schuckerts owned the property, and they wanted to sell it, so they told us we could have the barn that was over there. This is how the barn looked in transit. Here it's being pulled by a tractor up on the hill. And here we have a clearer picture of that. Another view. Yeah, you're right, Ruth. Surprised to see it together. Piled up to the right are all of the planks that were used to stabilize that when it was moved. So we did need parts to fix up that barn. So attorney Arthur Olson gave us this barn. And here we have a picture of the JCs who helped us with that project. There's our president again, Carl Rigatti, helping. And this is my husband, Cal Potter. The final building that we moved up was the Bosenstab Cheese Factory. And here's an article and a picture of that in transit. This is how it looked on its original location. Here it's being lifted onto a flatbed truck. Another picture on the road. Notice on the right here, there's a man from the utilities holding up the wire so it doesn't get hooked up on the roof. And we were fortunate when it came to costs that the utility companies would do this for nothing, so they didn't charge us. That's Ed Fisher, the project chairman, restoring it. And this is how it looked when it was finished, with the old dairy products out in front, implements out in front. It was landmarked when it was on the museum grounds. Okay, so the museum then rescued and reinforced the community's cultural identity through a balance of displayed artifacts and programs. So we established an identity through the buildings and interior exhibits. So in the Victorian house, we've got the 1850s lifestyle, and in our surrounding farmstead, we have pioneer heritage in the log house, farming heritage in the barn, and the Wisconsin cheese industry, especially reflective of Plymouth in the cheese factory. I'm going to show you what some of the other exhibits look like in the Taylor House, and I'm sorry this one isn't in color. This one was used last week, but I'm going to show you a color picture after a while. So this was the parlor, which was set up on the second floor, and I'll tell you after a while why it was up there. This is the bedroom setting, also on the second floor. Here's another part of that bedroom setting. And this is our bathroom setting with the sitz bath. The wallpaper is still up there, and the wainscoting is still painted white, and it looks wonderful, even though there's nothing in there anymore. This was the interior of the log house when it was furnished. I noticed the stump puller's been moved. It used to stand near the log house, and of course it was used for pulling stumps up out of the ground after the trees were chopped down. And here's a picture of Vern Beckman in the barn with our display consultant, George Lull, and a feed cutter. They were setting up displays for the dedication of the barn. Eventually, a corn crib came up. And that's Ed Fisher in the cheese factory with the cheese press. We also established an identity through stories. There were lessons to be learned, especially we had one natural history exhibit of birds. It was a bird collection. There were rarely seen birds in there. There was a black-necked stilt that had only been seen in Wisconsin 3 times, and then a pair of passenger pigeons that are extinct, of course. They were hunted mercilessly out of existence. This is just part of the bird collection. In fact, that picture is posted out in the exhibits here right now. And the stilt isn't in there, but down in the right-hand corner, you can see the passenger pigeons on the big perch in the back. And the press was especially interested in stories about those birds. So we did take them out of the case once so that they could get a better picture. So then we established our identity through events, through Pioneer Heritage Days, German Heritage Days, Dutch Heritage Days, and a farming threshery and circus days. We always served our traditional German sausage, bratwurst. They're frying hamburgers there, but believe me, we served bratwurst. We gave covered wagon rides in bridal carriages. We had demonstrations. This woman is weaving out in front of our log house. And these bales of hay were set up for people to sit on for the barn dedication. And then on that day, we had haying demonstrations, and this old tractor hooked up to an old hay wagon. Back in the Taylor house, we had our circus exhibits. And this is a picture of Fred Wendland with his own personal collection that he brought out to the museum for circus days one year. And it was set up in a tent like the one on the left. And again, you can see the crowds this drew. And here's a better shot of that German band playing. I was always in the buildings, so I never really got a chance to see these crowds until I looked at these pictures. We also had flea markets, and I think this picture must have been taken from a fire escape. The fire escape on the west side of the building. We did make money on those flea markets. So people, of course, fulfilled the museum's mission. And the museum staff did have a passionate belief in the objective world. They were convinced that the objects were worth showing, demonstrating, and seeing because, as I said earlier, collections are the common thread in museums. So in 1977, the personnel roles became administrative and educational. We heard about the caretakers last week. We were moving on to a director and docents. These are earlier caretakers. This is Frida and Ted Mosh out on the fire escape when a tree had come down in a storm. But when I started, this sounds monumental, but I did everything. I was the curator, hired and trained the personnel, recruited volunteers, interacted with the local news media, wrote the newsletter, prepared the budget, and collaborated on maintenance. Of course, I had help with all of that, and I'm going to get into that. Here I am pictured with a salesman for an alarm company. We had to update and expand on our alarm system, especially with those new buildings. The director worked with the display consultant to select artifacts, display artifacts, provide signage. And that's our display consultant, George Lulligan, seated there. I'm using this particular picture because he used to work for the Boston store in Milwaukee. And he wasn't only good at arranging exhibits, he was good at working with models. So we had we're participating in a bridal show at Sunny Ridge. And he selected all of these dresses from the museum collection for us to wear. And he knew just what dress would fit what person and what would look the best on who. So he's pictured on the left with two guides again, Virginia Klunk and Marie Siebert. And then in the middle behind him is Lena Landwehr. She was our maintenance man's wife. And then next to me on the right is Lynn Cohan. We cooperated with individual collectors to support the museum with the exhibit tasks, so we determined temporary exhibits to accompany the permanent exhibits. So here's a picture of Ruth Winfield with her lace collection that dated back to 1777. That was quite fascinating, and I wish I had more time to tell you the story about the lace. Now, our display consultant, George Lull, had to group the exhibits, the items in like categories to make sense out of them, because the interior of the Taylor House, I've never seen it in its original state. It was used as a jail, amongst other things, and the walls were removed, and so I'll show you what he did with the displays. We're back to the music room. So he set this one area up just as a music room. This is one end of our farm implement room. Notice we don't have typewriters mixed in or anything else. It's just farm implements. This is a color picture of the parlor, which was on the second floor, I said. And this is another picture from the bathroom. And again, it was a real life setting. So the docents, we had descriptive signs and narratives all over the rooms for people who just browsed. But the docents expanded on those by weaving stories around the collections. So in these two pictures, we're taking school children through. And the guide on the left, that's Catherine again, she's explaining the medical instruments which were displayed there. And a real interesting story was centered around the bloodletting tool that we heard about last week. The kids were fascinated with that story. And then there was a picture hanging of a doctor. You can't see it here. And I think his last name was Brickbauer. But anyhow, he was a pioneer doctor, and he experimented on himself with medicines that he mixed up. And so that also made an interesting story. The staff and volunteers were costumed because the costumes caught the attention of children and teenagers and drew them in. They made the tour experience more interactive. And the costumes compared the apparel of the past to the present. This is older picture of earlier volunteers. I'm going to talk about all three of them eventually, but right now I'm going to start with Ruth Winfield standing in the center. She made the mannequins seated there before we got mannequins from department stores. But she also made the costumes that we wore. And that was typical day wear of somebody living in the Taylor house in that time period. This was opening day. One year we served refreshments in our one lone workroom. And Ruth also made the embroidered apron that I'm wearing for special occasions. She made one for every guide. And it's really beautiful, and I'm just sorry that you can't get a better look at the embroidery. The volunteer in the middle is Emily Anderson wearing a dress from the collection. And the volunteer on the left, Melba Coon, is wearing one of her own dresses. This was used for a publicity shot. They all did a good job of acting like people had to, when they sat for so long, except for the one on the right who's smiling. But anyhow, all of these volunteers, again, did the shot for the Sheboygan Press. So standing in back on the left is Jane Blanke. That's George Lull in the Civil War uniform. Bonnie Olshansky to his right. Seated is Emma Plappert, our treasurer. On the left, next to her is Emily Anderson again. And then that little girl was our maintenance man's granddaughter, and I just can't remember her name. We got always pictures back from the children. And I'm using this one again because the pictures always came back with the guides in costume. So the curator had to look for what was missing because the museum's supposed to be educational. It's not just a tourist attraction. So what we did was we scheduled Sunday afternoon exhibits and demonstrations. And this is a picture of a man with his railroad memorabilia. I don't recall, I'm sure we didn't have any railroad memorabilia in the collection. That's Mark Fredericks. We had quilts. We couldn't display all of them, so one Sunday afternoon, a quilter came in and displayed her quilts and showed those. And I don't recall having any political memorabilia. So this is Elmer Koppelman, who came in one day with his political collection. Another Sunday afternoon, the Drury's from Plymouth did a maple sugar demonstration. So we attached scholarship to the collections to make them lively, not just dead objects. And we did that through research, publications, and lectures. So researchers came to the museum to study the collections. Art students, for example, came who were studying the decorative arts, and they studied the furnishings mainly. And then we did have ornithologists come and study the bird collection. We had ships, of course, model ships on display. So then for one of our evening programs, we invited these divers in. They dove to explore old shipwrecks, and they spoke to us one night. Roland Schomburg wrote a book of reminiscences of Sheboygan County from 1917 to 1930. The title was That, and That's the Way It Was. It won a State Historical Society award. We sold the book and we used the proceeds to fund the farmstead that was set up. During the bicentennial in 1976, there was a great interest in genealogy developing, genealogy research. So a local organization formed and thrived. And both that gene organization and the Historical Society had books and records. And then at the same time, the local landmarks organization wanted to restore a building. So the three organizations worked together to establish the Sheboygan County Historical Research Center, which you've probably all been in, a depository of historical records to provide for research, publications, and lectures. So among the museum objects were a painting of a Civil War soldier and a trunk filled with Civil War discharge papers. This is the oil painting of Gustav Wintermeyer. And this is one of those Civil War discharge papers which belonged to Patrick Krogan. So one of the first things the Gene Society did was approach the courthouse, the county board, for a room at the courthouse to set up a research center. And they did give them a room on the lower level. That got a lot of publicity, and the Office on Aging said they wanted the room. And so the county board reversed their decision and said we had to leave. But that also got a lot of publicity. So the Johannings of the Plymouth Review said that we could use the Falls News Building as a research center. So here's a picture of the opening of that research center in the Falls News Building. That's the first director, Sharon Schleicher, in the middle. On the right is Barry Johanning of the Plymouth Review. And on the left is Marlon Miller, a county board member. And of course, eventually the mill house was restored. This is what it looks like today. And that was a publicity shot for the opening. Here we have a picture of Mary Meyer, one of our volunteers. She cleaned up that painting, put it in a frame. She's being assisted by a volunteer from the research center. And it hangs out there today. Maybe you've seen it. If not, you'll have to look for it. It's on the first floor. This is just a picture of an example of some of the historic books went out there. This is The History of Sheboygan County by Zillier, and I believe they date to 1912. One of the first authors after the research center opened was Elmer Koppelman, and the title of his book was The Branded Hand, The Struggles of an Abolitionist. And then another early author was Janice Hildebrand, and her book was titled The Heart of Sheboygan County. So the caretakers were considered courthouse personnel. By caretaker now I mean the maintenance man. And they maintained the buildings and grounds. They were responsible for Taylor Park. They acted as guides during busy times. They wrote stories around the collections, and they repaired the artifacts. Here is Edgar Aschenbach again, the first maintenance man I started with. And he was responsible for taking care of that Grand Lake street clock in front of the museum. And in this case, we were cleaning it up and having it repaired. We had lots of volunteers. We established a service committee to involve volunteers from various aspects of the community. They cataloged the artifacts. So I'm back to this picture. The woman seated on the right now is Marie Barkman. She was the director of Meade Public Library. And of course, she knew how to catalog, so she set up the cataloging system. She died about a year after I started, so this is a picture of Doris Hebner, who took over that job. And notice Doris is typing on an old manual typewriter. That's exactly what we were still using in 1977. They had assisted the display consultant. Here's a picture of Emma Plappert helping George Lull set up the log cabin. They were gardeners. We had garden beds on the east side of the building that were plants put in every spring. Standing is Behan, and kneeling is Ruth Winfield. And then if you look at the back of the picture, you can see the silo in the Shuckett barn across the street. That's before it was moved. Our first program director was a service committee member, Dolores Mirsch. And here's a picture of her standing on the right. And next to her, this was the dedication of the log house, and standing next to her is Mayor Richard Susha. They raised money. They created items to sell. They planned card parties. They baked and sold cakes and pies for museum days. And they organized flea markets for museum days. So here's a picture of some of the things they sold for us to sell at the front desk. The cat, the calico cat, and the tree. And that's a copy of our first cookbook, Christmas Goodies. They made bookmarks. They collected wildflowers out in the fields surrounding the house. And they were just lovely. This is one that I kept for myself. Here's an example of the cakes and pies they brought in for museum days. We couldn't get them all on the table, actually. They're all over the place. And here we are outside, some of them holding their pies. Standing on the left is Esther Benninger. Next to her is Dolores Mirsch. Sitting on the bench in front of me is Clara Blasik, our secretary. And then on the right again is Emma Plappert, our treasurer. And here's a shot of another flea market. They had a raffle table, of course, where they sold raffle tickets and then people won prizes, and that's George Lowe again at the raffle table. This is Russell Neri. He was a volunteer on the display committee, but he was also a printer by profession. And one museum days, he brought up an old printer and was doing demonstrations for people. This was our first Christmas memories in 1990, and that's Bill Holbrook in the middle, dressed and impersonating Judge Taylor. And to his right is Marie Frakes, another one of our guides. We had good publicity at the time. The press, of course, was a much bigger operation, and they would send 2 reporters out all the time to cover our stories. So we had a great bonds with the press reporters. We did radio interviews, cable television interviews. We had entries in parades. We provided exhibits for other organizations like Washington School for their 75th anniversary. We did an exhibit booth for a Mead Library hobby show. We had always had booths at the county fair. And we had history fairs at Memorial Mall. And we, of course, we started the newsletters. Here's one of our entries in one of the parades. And here's another entry. I think that it's obvious it's Prangies. Was it then Yonkers and then the Boston store, just the reverse? Anyhow, it's an early picture. This is a display George Lowe did for one of Mead's anniversaries. And this is Vernon Audrey Beckman at the hobby show with all of the publications we had at our front desk. I'm sorry this isn't a better picture, but that's one of our booths at the fair, which we shared with the Genealogy Organization and the Historical Research Center. So I'm getting back to the bridal show. I'm just using this to show you what kind of publicity we got. I couldn't scan the whole thing. It was a half-page article they did for us on the bridal show. And I'm using this picture again because I just want to point out the dress I'm wearing on the far right is an 1885 wedding dress. So we had history fairs at Memorial Mall, which Bob Harker orchestrated and set up, and he's going to talk more about those next week. I'm going to show you pictures of what our booth looked like. And I'm doing this because if you notice those fantastic blow-ups of the museum in the back, that's George's work again, putting that exhibit together for our booth. This was another year, and the woman on the left is Elaine Stolzenberg. She also planned several of our museum days. And this was one of the largest items that was brought in for the history fair, a 1909 Huckmobile. This was one of our first newsletters. Actually, I think we started the newsletter in 1976, but this is the only remaining one I have from 1977. And you probably can't read those center columns, but basically this newsletter was all about the volunteer committees and who was on them. So our goals were met from these funding sources: memberships, admission fees, gift shop sales, solicitations, museum days, card parties, and the Sheboygan County Board of Supervisors. We did have some good bonds formed with the county board through people like Charles Broughton, Roland Schomburg, Carl Regatti, and Marlon Miller. Charles Broughton was before my time. He actually died before I ever started out there. But he was the president of the Historical Society, I think, for 23 years. He was a Wisconsin Historical Society curator, a Sheboygan Press publisher and editor. Broughton Drive and Marsh Park are named after him, and he championed the museum for county board funding. And this is a picture of him. So as a result of all his efforts, the museum became a county department. The employees were county personnel, and we had the services of all the county departments: clerk, treasurer, auditor, personnel department, maintenance. Roland Schomburg, who was the county clerk at the time, was elected president of the Historical Society. He served more than one term. But his biggest contribution was, now we heard last week that Taylor Park had historic status, but actually all of the acreage up here was not designated for historical purposes. And we were worried that somebody might decide to put a restaurant up on the hill. So Roland got the county board to designate all of that property for historic purposes. When he gave up the presidency, Carl Regatti was elected president. He was also a county board member, and he was very good at helping us get our budgets passed before the county board. He actually was chairman of the property committee, the main committee that the museum dealt with. So the museum budgets increased in small annual increments. Money was not received for all requests. Declined requests were resubmitted the following year. But eventually, the county board still moved the museum from department status to grant status to cut salary and benefit costs. And that's even though the Wisconsin statutes encourage and empower historical preservation at the local level. The local county officials still vary in their desire to support and do that. So then the Historical Society became responsible for all of those services that I pointed out before. This is what the staff looked at about that time. Behind me are the three guides again: Lynn Cohan, Marie Siebert, and Virginia Klunk. And sitting next to me was the next maintenance man, and he had an assistant who's not in this picture. Marlon Miller, who you saw pictured in the genealogy room at the Falls News Building, was also a county board member, and he was very supportive of the museum and historical efforts. So funding then is always one of priorities of museums, government, individuals, and corporations if they're contributing, and it all depends on what they're interested in, so it's a real balancing act. My most humorous experience was the idea that the Taylor House was haunted. I'll tell you how that happened. We had an electric typewriter eventually with daisy wheels with a different type on, and every once in a while the daisy wheels would just start to spin. And at the same time, it always sounded like there was just somebody pacing around upstairs looking at the exhibits. That had to have been the wind, but we'd always run up to make sure that nobody got up there without us knowing about it. And then when we locked up nights, there'd be a tapping in the barn that we could never figure out. So when a reporter was up at the press one time doing a story on German Heritage Day, the staff was laughing about this, and the reporter went back and surprisingly did this article, which some board members thought was ridiculous, but it got a lot of attention, and a lot of children came in and wanted to know if the house was really haunted. My biggest regret is that, it's hard to fit museums into a societal puzzle. Actually, according to the American Association of State and Local History, history is the lowest funded discipline. Isn't that depressing? 55% of American museums are historical museums. They're well attended, and they do create good economic impact. But getting them higher up on the priority list is always a challenge. My most rewarding feeling was that the museum is an important social service because society is reflected in the society of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and that's especially important for children. We included children in as many things as we could. This was a publicity shot for opening day, and that's Corrine Anderson with a Edison photograph. The children did remember their tour guide stories. They brought their parents to the museum and conducted tours for their parents. They'd repeat the tours back to their parents practically just the way we conducted the tours. And then they sent thank you letters and drawings about their museum experience. This is a nice thank you letter we got from Dorothy Simon at Wilson School. This is a nice, well-written thank you from a student in Howard's Grove. He was the class scribe. His name was Mike Velker. This is a picture of a Grand Lake clock, one of the many pictures we got. And we would use those pictures in our exhibits. And I wish those were in color because they're just adorable pictures. In fact, the one on the top is of a woman posing in front of our old camera, but actually in the photography room we did not have a mannequin, so that was real imagination there. The two little girls here are my nieces, Jessica and Beth Potter. Jessica's on the left. And they were featured in this shot because the rocking horse and the doll belonged to their grandmother, Irene Potter. They didn't want to cooperate that day. They didn't like the press reporter with the big camera. An outhouse was moved up. And here we have a guide telling the students what it was like living without indoor plumbing. So my most satisfaction then came from wondering how the students' lives would be inspired by their museum experience. I always wondered, who will the next historians be? And I was very happy for their interest. So we've seen then that the museum is an archive of objects similar to an archive of documents. That's what's most useful about the museum is the arousal of curiosity, and that the museum provokes people to ask questions and engage in research. So the museum is like a computer. It teaches us to look back, to systematically assimilate information, to analyze gathered experience, and to ideally predict the future. So in spite of our financial struggles, we've really made a lot of progress here. We would dream about the fireplaces, the staff in the Taylor House when I was there. And now actually one of the original fireplaces that was in the attic has been put back in. The fireplaces have been opened up. And there are 2 donated marble mantles in there. And now we're in this brand new facility. So founding members, like Mrs. Emil Muse on the left, Ruth Winfield, I call them, really, I don't know if they were founding members. I did know a founding member, Ray Van Handel. I'm sorry I don't have a picture of him. Anyhow, they were early members, and they'd be very pleased where the museum is today. So I was very happy to go from the Taylor House to this complex and to be here tonight, to stand in this new building and tell you the story of those 14 years. Okay.
Thank you so much, Betty.
Yeah.
And I would love to help field some questions. We have a
Okay.
microphone if you want to use it.
If they can hear with us, I'll
if
keep it
the
on.
question askers want to use it, and then you can keep it.
Okay, sure. Okay, sure. Go ahead.
They should use it whenever they want to or not.
Yeah. You do want them to? Okay, you're going to use the microphone. Thank you.
I'd like to hear about the Ruth Winfield doilies. You said there was a story.
Well, they all came from England. Harold Winfield, her husband's family, they all came from his family, and they came from England. And that's about all I can tell you now, Pat. I'd have to reread that whole article to give you more information on how they were made. Yeah. If anybody wants to hear anything a little extra about those three buildings, my husband's here, and he's the one who worked on that project. So, Cal, where are you? Do you want to say anything?
But when I was young, a good friend of mine was Vernon Bakeman. Vern, you can thank him a great deal for the barn and the log house. Vern grew up on a farm. He worked for Dairy Herd Improvement before he went to the Sheriff's Department. And he worked his way up in the Sheriff's Department, eventually to become sheriff. Matter of fact, he was sheriff twice. He was sheriff, then he decided, he was convinced that he wanted to go to the assembly. He spent 2 terms in the assembly, and he didn't like it. He'd rather be sheriff, and he was elected sheriff again in 1974, the year I was elected to the legislature, and I really took his seat in the legislature. But Vern grew up on a farm, was Dairy Herd Improvement, and so his dedication to getting that barn in place and having all these artifacts there was indispensable. He also knew everybody. When I was on the campaign trail, I would make sure I would follow Vern around because there was no one who knew more people than Vern Bateman. And he could get the Deputy Sheriff's Association to do that heavy lifting of those logs. My contribution was I labeled the logs. And it was done without the benefit of the Home and Garden TV where you've got that Barnwood Builders. And so I had to devise it myself, but that's what I did there. And then when we went to the Art Olson's barn, we needed to take apart that barn in order to get a complete barn on this property. I remember the first day I went in there because I was sort of a naive city kid. I walked in that barn and one of my legs went right through the floor, and I was there with one leg dangling into the lower part of the barn, and I was on my knee on the other one. I didn't hurt myself, but I told everybody else, the JCs, and said, don't walk into that barn until you know where you're setting, because the thing was in rough shape. And so Vern was very instrumental in those 2 movings. And then Ed Fisher, I didn't work on that project very much, but Ed was a farm kid. He wrote the book about cheese factories in Sheboygan County, and this was really something of a project that he really wanted to see done, and it did come to fruition. So we had some good people in the right places to recruit people, and a lot of people were dedicated to get these projects done.
Yeah, we had the right people coming together at the right point in time. And I mean, the hours that went into those museum days, I can't tell you, those were big projects. So it was just perfect timing. And
as far as getting collections, do people just volunteer collections if they're cleaning out their houses after relatives died, or did they pursue collections?
we only once asked for a set of dishes because of all the things we didn't have in that house was a set of good dinner dishes. And that set that was brought in wasn't really very old, but no, they brought things in voluntarily. I don't know, we'll hear from Travis, I guess, what happens today when he talks in 2 weeks.
Same thing.
Okay. Yeah. So, but then we couldn't then and we can't now take everything, because of the storage problem and duplication. So Travis will get into that too. Carol?
Do you ever contact the Sharon Richardson resale for anything? Because if you've ever been in there, you should see some of the beautiful dishes in that they have for sale, because nobody wants that stuff anymore.
Well, it really should have a local history tie. I mean, So they would have to know, or we'd have to have somebody in there checking all the time. I mean, it should have a local history tie. We don't want to take just any
Well, right. but-
pretty old set of dishes.
But
You know.
you could alert them. Do they ever check for you if they see something that comes in locally?
I don't know, they weren't there when I was the director. Sharon Richardson, do you hear from them?
Yeah, so some of those resale stores will occasionally contact us. If someone working there knows that this item may have some value to Sheboygan County history, like Betty said, our first goal is to collect items that tell the story of our county. So it has to have a strong connection to Sheboygan County history. But we have accepted items from some of those places. The most recent one was a Garten toy tricycle that came through the Habitat resale store.
Good.
So it does happen. Yep.
Yeah, I don't think we had any garden toys at all when the Gardens brought their exhibit in. I'm sure we didn't.
Yeah, I think that Bob's era.
Okay, okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I wonder what is this microphone on? Yes. I wonder what the gooey center of those museum days were. What was it that made it popular at that time? Was it the pie? Was it the people dressed up in period clothing? Was it just that was one of the main places in the community?
Well, it was our bonds with all of those media outlets. Al Chop had a program called 60 Plus on cable TV, and he would have people on from the Historical Society, and he'd interview them about something that was going on. And the press was wonderful with their coverage.
Betty, I know you've done a little bit of historical research since your time at the museum. Did you want to share anything about that you've done in Sheboygan?
If you're talking about, Mead Public Library had a scanning project, and they got a humanities grant, and they wanted people to bring in their historic family photographs. And I had over 200 of those because I had pioneer relatives in Sheboygan County. Then they decided they would do the churches, and I was the archivist for my church, Grace Episcopal Church. So Pat Sather and the Hanlons, Ann and Bob, who belonged to the same church, they helped scan all of those church materials. And all of those items now are posted on Ozaki Sheboygan Memories, Recollection Wisconsin, and Digital Public Library of America, so they're all online. So if anybody missed that opportunity, if Mead ever does it again, I think it would be, if you want to really preserve your family photographs and records, it was a worthwhile project, because at least there's a digital copy somewhere. Even if we put these things in the research room or the Historical Society, wherever they go, they could still be destroyed somehow. So and they're more accessible. The church records now, people could not get into our church records because they're stored very carefully, but now they can just look them up online.
You're talking about digitizing, you're talking about moving into a different time. And so we'll welcome Bob Harker to talk more about that next week, and Travis the week after. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and please have a snack on your way out. And Betty, thank you so much for preparing this presentation.